Good afternoon and welcome to Today Tonight. During this show, we'll be explaining the history of the Cold War, specifically the use of propaganda by the Soviet Union and America, and its effect on the earlier 20th century. Throughout the show, there will be an education section and a section with a real-life expert on the topic. Here's Thomas with the story.
The Cold War was a state of political and military tension that rose after World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union. This period lasted between 1947 to 1991 and came to an end with the collapse of the Soviet Union. During this period, many forms of war came about where there was political and military conflict, and both sides were heavily armed in preparation for an all-out nuclear world war. The term cold is used as there is no large-scale fighting directly between both sides, only proxy wars that both sides supported. They did this through the use of propaganda, which is implemented into sport, television, movies, literature, and education.
Propaganda became incredibly important in the Cold War, with both sides using it extensively. The United States and the USSR became propaganda machines, oftentimes producing a new poster of propaganda every week. Propaganda became the way that both sides controlled the viewpoints of their people and shaped their opinions of those on the other side. Propaganda in the Cold War reached its height in the 50s and 60s, its purpose to demonize communism while building up the American way of life, capitalism, democracy, and vice versa.
But let's see what can happen elsewhere in, say, the small town of Moiso, Wisconsin. Peaceful, isn't it? But the red truncheon falls and the chief of police is hustled off to jail. Next, public utilities are seized by fifth colonists. Watch carefully what happens to an editor who operates under a free press. He goes to jail too, and his newspaper is confiscated. Exit freedom of thought. Yes, this is life under the Soviet form of government.
Most of the dramas, radio series, plays, and sitcoms made in America in the 50s openly expressed the advantages of living in a capitalist, prosperous nation. Such things like school, the classic American family, obedience, and loyalty were all openly promoted, and people believed it. Other propaganda pieces aimed to instill fear in the American people, to insinuate the idea that communists were plotting for the demise of the American way of life all around them.
If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist.
Children were targeted heavily. This was done so by putting pieces of propaganda in products bought by children. The 1951 Children's Crusade Against Communism bubblegum cards are a great example of how propaganda is treated with a younger audience. The cartoon depictions in these cards are bright and colorful, with the text being easy to understand, so as to appeal to a younger audience.
An evil so pervasive.
Propaganda was heavily used in schools, the most popular piece being Duck and Cover, an educational video about what to do in the event of a nuclear blast. Here, children are told to duck and cover just like Bert the cartoon turtle to avoid danger and injuries during a nuclear blast.
It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town. But if you duck and cover like Bert, you will be much safer.
I'd like to introduce you to the leading expert in Cold War propaganda, John Gaze. So John, can I call you John? No. Alright, Mr. Gaze, welcome to the show. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the Soviet and American propaganda machines?
The USA and the USSR already had strong, long-standing propaganda industries by the time the Cold War rolled around. Both countries had already been through 2 world wars, and propaganda was a very large part of that.
So propaganda was an actual industry?
Yes, the propaganda industries in their respective countries were much like any other industry in the same countries. In America, the propaganda machine was much like the advertisement industry. in which the government often employed private companies or artists to develop many of their posters and PSAs. It was a little different in the Union, as all industries were government mandated as opposed to privately run. Both industries were quite well run and did their jobs admirably.
Could you elaborate on how propaganda was used in different generations?
Education was harnessed for the purposes of the Cold War to instill political values in the young. Education systems in both the US and the USSR received dramatic boosts in funding, particularly in maths and sciences.
Could you elaborate on how propaganda was used in different generations?
Many American students were featured in small 10 to 20 minute movies about personal development like hygiene, manners, respect for others, and appropriate behavior. Many examples contained obvious political messages or subtext, such as one titled, How to Spot a Communist. There were also ubiquitous instructions and duck and cover drills to show what to do in the event of a nuclear attack.
How was propaganda used on children? Did they understand it? And how was it effective?
In the case of the Cold War, media that was more appealing to children were more likely to spread the messages they contained. That's why things like comic books, schools, and textbooks were fused with propaganda, as it meant that they would learn the messages. They were also used in between children's shows and cartoons.
How was propaganda used in film and TV?
Soviet and Western intelligence was a common theme. The Cold War made strides in the science fiction genre in movies such as Red Planet Mars, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and The Blob. All contained aliens who could take control of the world by stealth. Cold War themes were also revived in 1980s films such as Red Dawn and Rocky. American television in the 1950s promoted conservative family values and the virtues of American society, particularly in its situational comedies. The villains in children's cartoons like Rocky and Bullwinkle and Roger Ramjet were nothing more than stereotypical European communist agents.
Thank you, Thomas. That's all we have here on Today Tonight. Catch us on next week's special, Donald Trump, Is He an Alien? Thanks for tuning in. Good night.